Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are tossing aside all those crazy Hollywood myths and modern prejudices about ancient Rome. We're sticking strictly to the facts, the historical sources, and the actual evidence left behind by the Roman spectacle machine itself. We're going to completely deconstruct the gladiator arena to figure out how this fascinating, and honestly pretty brutal, ecosystem actually functioned.
Okay, let's dive into this. When you picture the Roman arena, you probably imagine this absolute chaos, right? Just a bloody free-for-all where guys were thrown randomly into a pit to fight for survival. But was that really the case? That's the first major myth we need to bust to truly understand the calculated genius behind the ancient spectacle.
Well, the reality, backed up by both archaeological and literary evidence, is actually entirely different. The Roman arena was not a place of bloody chaos. It was a rigorously classified, highly structured program of deeply asymmetrical and perfectly ordered duels. Everything was calculated mathematically. It wasn't meant to be a realistic battlefield simulation. It was designed as a clear, dramatic, and incredibly legible visual spectacle for the crowd.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the ethnic origins of gladiators. 2, the logic of pairs and perfect asymmetry. 3, tactics covering shields, weapons, and mobility. 4, canonical gladiators versus entertainment. And finally 5, hunts, animals, and comedians.
All right, starting off with part 1. Ethnic origins of gladiators, from defeated enemies to imperial classes.
So, where did these specific fighter classes actually come from? Early on, during the Republic era, the Romans had this very specific habit of literally staging their conquered enemies right there on the sand. You had fighters named after actual ethnic groups, like the Samnis or the Gauls, fighting with the specific gear of those people. But think about it, by the Augustan era, those groups had been completely assimilated. They were Roman citizens. It became politically sensitive, maybe even a little awkward, to kill a Gaul for sport. So by the Flavian era, which is when they built the Colosseum, these identities transitioned into fully standardized, abstract imperial classes, like the famous Murmillo. The fighter was no longer a living enemy, they were a technical prototype.
Which brings us right into part 2, the logic of pairs and perfect asymmetry, designing the spectacle.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core of the arena. Roman matchmakers had absolutely zero interest in symmetrical fights where two identical guys just bashed heads. They wanted what we call legible asymmetry. Take the most classic matchup of all time, the Murmillo versus the Thrax. On one side, you have the Murmillo. He's massive, heavy, and relies on static, crouching defense behind a huge rectangular shield. On the other side, the Thrax. He's incredibly light, highly mobile, and uses a small shield with a curved Sica blade that's specifically designed to hook right around that heavy defense. It's the ultimate immovable object matched up against continuous shifting agility.
It's wild to think about, but an entire gladiator's tactical identity stemmed from just one piece of equipment, their shield. Fighters holding those huge rectangular shields made up the Scuterari class. They had maximum coverage and formidable defense, but virtually zero mobility. Then you had the Parmulari, named after their tiny round shield, the Parma. What they lost in defense, they absolutely made up for in pure speed and aggressive angles. Your shield literally dictated whether you were going to advance like a tank or dance around your opponent.
Let's move to part 3, tactics, including shields, weapons, and mobility. The cat and mouse dynamic.
When you mix those specific weapons with completely different mobility levels, you create an incredible tactical narrative. Look at the most famous rivalry of all Roman antiquity. Step 1, you've got the Retiarius, who has almost no armor. He uses high mobility, keeps his distance, and tries to cast a weighted net to completely disrupt the other guy's balance. Step 2, the Secutor, who is an armored machine relentlessly pursuing him. And get this, the Secutor's helmet was specifically engineered to be perfectly smooth, with no angles whatsoever, so the net of the Retiarius would literally just slide right off. It was a direct technological countermeasure. Finally, step 3, the Secutor closes the distance, entirely nullifying the reach of the trident for a brutal close quarters finish.
So the crucial point here is that the audience didn't pay to see two ordinary soldiers fight with identical swords. They paid for this extreme contrast. The long reach of a trident against heavy armor. Pure, desperate evasion against suffocating pressure. It was a perfectly balanced tactical equation that anyone in the stands could instantly understand and savor.
Now for part 4, canonical gladiators versus entertainment, drawing the line.
We need a quick shift in perspective here, because there's a huge misconception that anyone who stepped onto the sand was automatically a gladiator. Not true. The Romans, with their total obsession for order, drew an extremely sharp line. That distinction was called the armature,
To be a true canonical gladiator, you had to belong to these formal, highly regulated classes. We're talking strict, immutable armor sets and highly established rules for lethal pairings. They were the absolute technical elite.
But outside of those elite formal classes, you had an entire army of what were essentially arena animators. You had venatores, who were these skilled theatrical hunters, bestiari, who handled and fought raw beasts, pagniari, doing comic mock combat, and of course, condemned persons who were unarmed and non-professional. All these groups operated in a totally adjacent ecosystem, completely outside the strict rules of the armaturi. So yes, they were a huge part of the spectacle, but technically speaking, absolutely not gladiators.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, Hunts, Animals, and Comedians, the broader spectacle ecosystem.
Even when we look at the animal encounters, there was a really strict hierarchy. You had a fundamental difference between the bestiari and the venatores. The bestiari were often super lightly geared handlers or even prisoners fighting chaotically as a form of punishment. It was all about raw dominion and cruelty. But the venatores? These guys were highly skilled specialists. They put on spectacular staged hunts during the morning. The whole point was to show the crowd how the Roman Empire had total controlled mastery over even the most exotic beasts in nature.
Now, what's really interesting is this quote right here, which perfectly captures the essence of a totally unique role, the Pagniarius. These guys were literally the comedians of the arena. Between all the intensely bloody, lethal main events, these entertainers would walk out with blunted or fake weapons and simulate combat as a parody. It acted as a crucial relief valve for the audience, giving them a desperately needed smile to break up the overwhelming tension of constant death. It was literal humor surgically injected into the middle of brutality.
And just like that, we've put together the entire puzzle of the arena, which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question. We've seen today that Rome didn't actually want chaotic brawls. They wanted perfectly engineered, stylized asymmetry. They demanded absolute control, even over exactly how people fought and died in front of them. So when you take lethal violence and transform it into tactical engineering, aren't you actually exercising the ultimate, most terrifying act of psychological control? I'll let you chew on that one for a bit. Thanks for watching this explainer. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time.